Thanks everyone for having me here today. This is really exciting and special for me. I think it's the first time I've given the nuclear fuels presentation in Sudbury. I know quite a few of you, but for those who don't, as Kyle mentioned, my name is Greg Hoffman. I actually went to school at Ryan and did my undergrad in earth sciences. Went on to work for Falcon Bridge and Surface Exploration before stint with a few different juniors, and then had a bit of a career twist. I actually moved to Toronto and got a job as a mining analyst at a small brokerage firm. And I didn't know what a mining analyst did at the time. Still not sure I do. But anyway, had a really good time learning about the financial aspect of the mining industry, raising money for junior, mid-tier, and sometimes even senior companies to advance their projects and build mines around the world in many different commodities. And one of the commodities in 2003 that I first got asked to look at was uranium. And it was really fortuitous timing because at the time, uranium price was about $7 per pound. And over the next 4 years, from 2007 to 2008, or sorry, from 2004 to 2008, went from $7 to $138 per pound. It was really one of the crazy bull market runs of any commodity that I've seen in my 20 years. I was a uranium analyst at a very good time, learned a lot about the sector, learned a lot about the geology, learned a lot about the different companies operating, and have always stayed really close to my heart. I went on to do a couple different jobs in the financial space, always related to the mining sector. And then coming up on a year ago, I guess actually just a year ago exactly almost, I got approached by one of my uranium corporate clients. He's the chairman of a couple of the companies that I'd raised money for over the years, and asked me if I'd be interested in leaving my cushy broker job and getting my hands dirty again. And because he had a company called Nuclear Fuels that he had spun out of a larger company. And I'll get into some of the details. And they were looking for someone to come and be the CEO of that company. And to be honest, is a sector that I really like and thematic in terms of nuclear that I really believe in. I think there's some strategic importance and relevance to domestic U.S. uranium production. And it was with the backing of the larger company that actually is a current uranium producer in the U.S. I thought it was a really good setup. I jumped ship, left my cushy broker job, and took on the president CEO role in July of last year. And so coming up on 9 months now, I guess, and really enjoying it. So anyway, I'll walk you through a bit of, let's see here. Maybe we got a click. There we go. Okay, so um, for those who can see the number of slides on the Zoom, don't worry, we're going to go through some of these pretty quick. We won't keep you here till midnight, but we'll talk a little bit just about nuclear power and what I call the nuclear renaissance 2.0. We'll talk a little bit about the geology of uranium deposits, and then dive in a little bit more on the style of mineralization that's more common in the U.S. versus what we see in Saskatchewan, particularly in the Athabasca Basin. We'll talk about uranium production and specifically, the different ways of mining uranium. A lot of us are very familiar with open pit and underground mines being here in Sudbury. Little known fact, over half of the uranium produced globally right now is produced via in situ recovery or in situ leach. So it's a in-place mechanism of mining. So we'll talk about that because that's what we'll be looking to do. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about our projects that we're working on currently in Wyoming. So you can see here just on the slide, that's some of our local residents. This is all ranch land in Wyoming, where we're working. That's our office in the town of Casey, Wyoming, where I spend quite a bit. I'll actually be flying down there tomorrow morning. So in terms of nuclear, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on Wyoming because it's a very dominant thematic that's going on right now particularly in North America, but really a global phenomenon. If you rewind just 2 or 3 years ago, uranium was very polarizing. Nuclear energy in general. A lot of people were, under and, thought of the risks and the fears of that. Really, we've seen a sea change in terms of global attitude as nuclear power is really looked upon as the go-to method of producing baseload energy, 24/7, clean, always on. And really, with some of the recent developments post Fukushima, the safety record is much better, particularly with the next generation of reactors that are coming together. So really, even headed into the U.S. election, there was bipartisan support for nuclear energy. And then the conflict in Ukraine really exacerbated the situation. We'll talk a little bit about that and really push the U.S. to really try to reinvigorate the domestic nuclear fuel cycle, right from mining uranium domestically in the U.S. through to conversion, enriching, fuel fabrication, and then building new reactors. So there, in terms of the nuclear fuel cycle, and I'll spend just a little bit of time on this one. This is basically the journey that uranium makes through from we hear the well field because we're going to be talking about in situ recovery. So we're actually just pumping uranium laden water out of the earth. It goes to a processing plant. That's where we would produce yellow cake, and we'll get into that. Yellow cake is U3O8 in terms of chemical composition, and you can see here it's sold or it's transacted as a per pound metric, and you can see this is the long-term price chart. So this was the boom time I talked about, going from sub $10 up to over $130. That was a short-lived peak. We had both the global financial crisis as well as a massive ramp up in production at those higher prices from Kazakhstan. All that Kazakh production is in situ recovery as well. We had a long period of very quiet, and then a couple of years ago, the uranium price started to pick up again, and recently hit over $100 per pound. It's currently trading on the long-term contract about $80 per pound, and on the spot market about 65. Once you have the U3O8 or the yellow cake, you transport it, and then it goes through a conversion process. So basically, that's converting it from a solid into a gaseous form. That's done here in Ontario at Port Hope by Cameco. It's also done in the US, but most of that conversion capabilities are overseas, particularly in Russia. After the conversion, depending on the type of reactor that it's going to if it's a CANDU reactor like we have here in Canada, it can take that natural form of uranium in that converted state if it's fabricated into fuel. However, for the rest of the reactors globally, it needs to be enriched. And that's basically increasing the concentration of the fissile isotope, the uranium-235, from its natural concentration that's less than 1% up to 2 to 5%, depending on the type of reactor. Then you fabricate the fuel, then it goes to the reactor and produces the energy. And you can see here, just in the last couple of years, the conversion price as well as the enrichment price have had massive, massive moves higher. And that's all on the back of the conflict with Russia. Basically, the US has now moved to ban all the import of all uranium products from Russia, and that's put into law. So it cannot be overturned by an executive order. That's basically to help reinvigorate the domestic fuel cycle. So why US uranium? You don't hear a lot about it. Well, you used to. So this is basically the consumption overall, going back to the 1950s. And you can see from the 60s through the 80s, the US was effectively self-sufficient in terms of producing uranium. So geologically, it's very well endowed. And we'll talk a little bit about sort of the style of mineralization there. And at the right price, the US can produce a lot of uranium. You can see they're producing between 30 to 50 million pounds on a per year basis. We're talking about a global market right now that's consumes about 180 million pounds, and globally production's around 150 million pounds, with that difference made up from above ground stockpiles that are quickly dwindling. As I mentioned, lots of government support for the nuclear industry, and really that's why on the big push towards AI. That's been the very big thematic is, where's the power going to come from to drive, all the new AI data centers and the more energy intensive search engines that are being developed as related to that. And really a lot of those technology companies have come to the realization that it has to be nuclear. That's why we're seeing Amazon. That's why we're seeing Google. That's why we're seeing Meta all go out and become involved in reactor builds, reactor technologies, and are even starting to look up the fuel cycle towards conversion and enrichment. So in terms of geology, and I think a lot of us are technical people here, really, there's two main producing type styles of uranium mineralization. There's about 12 different deposit types, but most of the production comes from one of these two types. On the right side of the slide there, you can see the get my pointer here. There we go. Over here, this is what we call the unconformity style mineralization. This is what we have in Athabasca Basin. This forms the very, very, very high grade deposits of northern Saskatchewan. The global average for uranium deposits is about 0.15%. You get 2 orders of magnitude higher into the Athabasca Basin. It really is a freak of nature geologically in terms of the grades that produce there. And really that's what Cameco as well as the French government company Orano produce the bulk of their pounds from. However, that is a freak of nature. You have other unconformity style deposits globally, but nothing that gets to those sort of high grades. What we do have a lot more commonly globally in different jurisdictions are sandstone hosted deposits. So rather than at an unconformity here, we have a sandstone geological environment, and then a couple different sort of mechanisms in terms of how the uranium is deposited. And really, it's quite fascinating in terms of, even in the unconformity, it's really a, a brilliantly simple mechanism. When uranium is in an oxidizing environment, it's mobile, it's dissolved. So it travels with those hydrothermal fluids. As soon as you move into a reducing environment, the uranium is deposited. It drops out of solution and forms deposits. And really, that's the mechanism that we see in Athabasca Basin. It's also the mechanism that we see in terms of formation of these roll front deposits in different sort of stages. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. In the tables down below, they're a little bit small. I apologize for that. But you can see in terms of global production, this is the World Nuclear Association's data. They haven't come out with 2003 yet, so 2022 is the last year that we have. But you can see Kazakhstan is the dominant player in terms of uranium production. That's all these sandstone types deposits. Canada's number two. That's all these unconformity hosted deposits. And really, if you go down through these large mines, you've got Cigar Lake. That's one of Cameco's mines in the Athabasca Basin. You've got Inkai. You've got all of the Kazakh operations. Those are all in situ recovery. Then you've got the other meaningful one from a production perspective is Olympic Dam, where uranium is produced as a byproduct of copper. So, let's talk a little bit more about the sandstone hosted uranium deposits. So really here, this is a geological map of Wyoming. That's where we're focused. But you can see a number of these sandstone bases that exist within Wyoming. And those are the centers for where you can see these sandstone hosted uranium deposits. You can see, basically, how they're understood to have formed is basically erosion of granite, uranium enriched granites in mountains, and then deposited in fluvial basins. So you can see a modern setting here. Really, that's sort of the deposits that we're looking for. In terms of age, we're looking at Cenozoic age mineralization, so relatively young compared to the Athabasca Basin, which is Proterozoic in age. Obviously, also Elliott Lake, not far from here, where there's meaningful uranium production as well, much older as well, Proterozoic in age. Here we're talking about much younger systems. This is actually a really cool image that we found that was done by Homestake of all companies, who was active in uranium exploration in Wyoming in the late 70s and early 80s. And it's basically over top of the majority of our flagship project. We'll talk about it in a little bit, but you can see actually their interpretation of these braided stream systems and where the uranium mineralization is deposited along those. We'll talk a little bit more about that. So in terms of these sandstone-hosted deposits, the roll front variety is what is most commonly exploited both in the US as well as in Kazakhstan. There's also examples of it elsewhere, Mongolia, for instance, but those are the big producing jurisdictions right now. And really, this is what I talked about. So you've got a sandstone package. It's bounded above and below by either siltstones or mudstones. You've got uranium-bearing fluid that is traveling along through here in the oxidized environment. And then at some point, there's a reductant. Something happens that causes that oxidized fluid to become reduced, and the uranium drops out in this roll front style of shape right here. And then you get an upper limb and a lower limb, but the bulk of the high grade ore will be sit right here in the nose. And this is actually an outcrop from our property, where you can see one that's exposed on surface. Now that's great for the old time miners on this property, where back in the 50s they mined shallow open pits and small adits underground. That's not good for us when we're looking at this from an in situ recovery lens. We need to be below the water table for in situ recoveries, but we can use the surface mapping to help guide us understand the location of these roll fronts, and then chase them down dip to below the water table. These are another couple images from the archives from the work that was done on our property back in the 70s and 80s. And you can see here a schematic section basically showing where you've got the sandstone layers going through, There's an unconformity here between different ages of rock, and then you can see the roll fronts that are forming as you progress from the oxidizing environment into the reducing environment. So that's how they form. How do we get the uranium out? So this is where the in situ recovery process comes in. I'll spend a bit of time just explaining it. So because it is a very, very elegant, and as I mentioned, it's the dominant form of uranium production globally right now, and we expect that to continue. Now, it's a relatively new technology. It was first developed. We're actually just coming up on April 1st will be the 50th anniversary of the very first commercial ISR operation in that actually happened in Texas. But it's a very elegant solution for uranium mining, and there's actually some copper deposits that are being looked at and being advanced right now to use ISR as well. In the case of what is done in majority in the US, it's a very, very simple method to dissolve the uranium. You're basically taking groundwater, you're adding oxygen, maybe a little bit of sodium bicarbonate, so baking soda. You're pumping it down into the uranium bearing horizon. You're letting it interact with the uranium minerals there, mostly uraninite in the case of the sandstones that we're dealing with. It dissolves the uraninite coatings on the sandstone grains. That uranium is now in solution, and then there's an uptake well. We pump it up to surface. It goes to the processing plant, and it's basically dissolved. It's brought out of solution, dried and packed as yellow cake, and then sold to the utilities. So it's a really elegant solution for mining. You're not moving 1 ton of dirt. You're just using the naturally occurring groundwater with the addition of oxygen. Now in Kazakhstan, they use this same methodology, but in their case, they use sulfuric acid instead of oxygenated groundwater. So the sulfuric acid is incredibly efficient in terms of dissolving the uranium. It dissolves probably about half of the rest of the periodic table as well with it. So it's the rehabilitation costs, which in Kazakhstan they don't worry so much about, whereas in North America we're very cognizant of that. So that's why all the production currently, that's almost all the production. There's actually one operation that's just started up in Wyoming as well that has gotten permitted for what they elegantly call not an acid leach, a low pH leach. So, um, because basically their mineralogy and the lithology that they have does not the alkaline leach with the oxygenated groundwater does not get sufficient recoveries for it to be economic. So they needed to go to an acidic solution for that. So, and they actually did manage to get it permitted. It took a while, but they managed to do that. So in terms of these are just some actual photos. So as I mentioned, the parent company of Nuclear Fuels is a uranium producing company called Encore Energy. They have 2 operating in situ recovery plants in the state of Texas. These pictures are from Texas. I was there back in the fall. And it's easier to show these ones because in Texas, you can see the well fields, you can see the pipes, you can see the wellheads right here. Basically, you've got the well going down. You bring pump some of these are injection wells. You're injecting the oxygenated groundwater. Others are recovery wells where you're bringing the uranium bearing fluids back to surface, and then you either pipe them to the processing plant or you can truck them to the processing plant. This is one of the oxygen towers they use to add oxygen to the groundwater. Those are the pipes going to the processing plant. That's a remote ion exchange column where they establish those out in the field where it's too far to pipe, and so they'll do the ion exchange there and then truck the pregnant resin to the plant. So there's a couple different ways to do it. How it's different in Wyoming, you only see the wellhead. It gets pretty cold in Wyoming where we are, so you have to bury all the pipes or they'll freeze. So it's a little bit easier to show the Texas ones. So again, we're back to a similar diagram here. We've talked about the well field, then we're moving into the processing plant. So we talked about loading the resin, then we recharge the resin so it can go. We basically recycled 99% of the water is reused. So there's very, very little water loss over the course of the process. The uranium then gets basically goes through a filter press like you'd see in a dry stack tailings facility. Then you have the uranium. It has to be dried to a certain moisture content. Then it's packaged up in 55-gallon drums and it's shipped off to the conversion plant. So in the case of Encore Energy, our parent company, that goes to a conversion plant in Illinois. In Canada, it goes to Port Hope. So this is a picture of Encore's larger of the 2 plants. It's called Alta Mesa in South Texas. So Encore is the only operating uranium company with 2 operating plants right now in the U.S. Basically how nuclear fuels came to be. Encore made, remember that uranium price graph in 2017, 18, uranium prices started to tick up. They made the strategic decision to restart this and one other plant at that point. That was going to take all of their focus. So they made the strategic decision to take their earlier stage but highly prospective properties elsewhere and spin them out into a separate listed company. That was what became Nuclear Fuels and how we got our properties in Wyoming. So you can see here, this is another view of the plant. You can see inside the plant, that's actually the furnace for drying the uranium. You can see the drums here getting ready to be filled. You can see that's some of, from in the lab, a sample of the yellow cake. And then basically that's how much they fill these drums. At PDC, we actually had a contest at our booth recently where people had to estimate or guess the weight of one of these drums for its ship. So I don't know if anyone wants to take a guess. I didn't bring any of the prizes, but it's some pretty, uranium's a pretty dense mineral, so it's a or dense element, so they're quite heavy. So really that's the restriction. They weigh about just shy of 800 pounds per 55-gallon drum. So in terms of fast forwarding here into what we're working on right now. So really Nuclear Fuels took the earlier stage properties from Encore Energy. They're our largest shareholder. They own 19.9% of our equity. These are the properties that came over to us. They're located principally in Wyoming. Why Wyoming? Well, first of all, it's got the right geology, like we talked about a little bit. It's also what's called an agreement state. In the US, all nuclear activities are overseen by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, or the NRC, unless you are what's called the agreement states, which basically are states that have done the work with the NRC so that all permitting is downloaded to the state level. So there's 4 agreement states: Texas, Wyoming, Colorado, Utah. There, the permitting is meaningfully faster because the states are highly motivated to get these things up and running. It's actually legislated in Wyoming that permitting a new uranium operation from an in situ recovery perspective can take a maximum of 2 years. So, and you compare that to Canada, there's a great discovery that NextGen made, Rook One. It's going to be, one of the largest uranium mines in the world. I think we're working on 14 years now since discovery. And we just found out from the CNSC, the Canadian regulatory body, that their final hearing is going to be a year away. So we got another year to go. So then they start a 3.5-year construction. So the advantage of the US is fast permitting in the agreement states. And then building one of these well fields takes a year. Well field and the process plant done in a year costs about $50 million versus, probably, $2.5 billion for a full uranium underground infrastructure with mill in Athabasca. So we'll zoom in here. So, we talked about Wyoming. This is US uranium production going back to the year 2000. You can see it's very, very correlated with the price. This isn't an error here. Basically, uranium production over the last few years in the US has been virtually zero. It's starting to ramp back up now. US will produce less than 2 million pounds in 2025. But you can see, certain years are producing, 3 to 5 million pounds. The overall bar is US uranium production. The blue component of that bar, that's what comes out of Wyoming. So when the US turns on, Wyoming is a very, very big contributor, and that's because of how geologically prospective it is for uranium. So here's the map of northern part of Wyoming. For those who aren't familiar, Montana's up here, Alberta is just north of that. For the Yellowstone fans here, Yellowstone straddles the border between Montana and Wyoming, right up here. So we're located. So if I look on here, all of the stars, those are ISR projects. The red ones are past producers. Most of those red ones are in some sort of phase of being restarted at this point because uranium prices are basically sufficient now where they're economic. The green stars are ones that are being advanced. Our projects are shown in yellow. Our flagship is a Casey project, but then we also have the Bobcat, the Boot Heel down here in the Shirley Basin. It's a separate basin that is also got some, this Shirley Basin project right now is being built by one of our competitors. And then we recently staked the Tinsley project. We'll talk a little bit about that. So if I zoom in here into our flagship Casey project, so you can see here the black squiggly lines, those are the roll fronts. So there was in the basically this, 70s and 80s, there was 3,800 drill holes drilled on this property. Most of that exploration, though, was for conventional styles of mineralization, not in situ recovery. Because remember, in situ recovery really didn't become a thing until 1975. So we've got a huge database of holes that were drilled on this property. They basically do that drilling to map out the roll fronts, and they're able to define historical zones of uranium mineralization associated with those roll fronts, and they're shown in red here. These are other companies' projects over here. Nichols Ranch is owned by a company called Energy Fuels. Dave and I were talking about that just before. That's a past producing in situ uranium plant and well field that's currently being restarted. Christensen and Eargary, they're owned by a company called Uranium Energy Corp. They are back up and running now as of about 3 weeks ago. This North Butte is owned by Cameco. It was a satellite operation where they had a well field and then they trucked from North Butte up here all the way down to their Smith Ranch and Highland operation down here where they had their recovery plant. So you can see right now we're in advanced stage of restarting a number of these operations. Cameco hasn't restarted theirs yet. They're saying they need to see higher prices still, but it's something that they're keeping in their back pocket. In terms of our work, what I'm going to do right now is cut a slice. We're going to look at a long section right across here through the southern part of the River Basin. You can see here the stratigraphy of the Powder River Basin. These are these other uranium operations that are to our east that are in the process of being restarted. There's Gary Christensen, Nichols Ranch right next door to us. All the uranium mineralization there is hosted within what's called the Wasatch Formation. It's a sedimentary layer, combined sandstone, siltstones, some clay horizon or some coal horizons as well. What's interesting about our project is we're actually near the margin of the basin where we have outcropping of not just the Wasatch that's mineralized, but also the underlying Fort Union Formation, as well as the Lance Formation. We've got uranium mineralization in all three of those formations. And the great part about our project is that we're able to drill and test all of those formations within the depths of economic viability, which is about 1,000 feet at today's uranium prices. Whereas over here, these other formations are where you're too close to the center of the basin. They're too deep to get in them. So really, we get 3 kicks of the can on our Casey property. So in terms of if we're going to just zoom in on the western half of the project and talk a little bit about some of the historical work that was done, you can see here it's a more detailed geological map from our 43-101. Basically, those are the detailed roll fronts that have been previously identified by drilling. The different colors are the different formations. The tan color is the Wasatch. The green is the Fort Union, and then the brown is the Lance. We're really focused on the Wasatch and the Fort Union. Why is that? Well, remember that one project that I talked about that uses the low pH leach on the eastern part of the basin. I go back here. That's up here. The Lance project. I'll give you one guess which formation the Lance project is in. It's the Lance, and it needs acid to recover. We're very much focused on staying away from anything that requires acid because we're going to stick to the alkaline leach, just from an ease of permitting and environmental sensitivity perspective. So what we do is we're able to use these historical information as a guide to go out and look for extensions and expansions of the historical mineralization. But uranium exploration on the property stopped very, very suddenly in the early 1980s. Lo and behold, why? Because of 3 Mile Island. Basically, you had the U.S. uranium industry almost shut down on the back of the 3 Mile Island scare. And so really, my thesis on this property was not that they had exhausted the exploration potential, more that they had basically stopped mid-stride. Our 43-101 authors of our technical report agreed. They did an exploration target, something that's more commonly seen in Australia, but we're starting to see it more in North America under 43-101. It is allowed. They came up with an exploration target of between 10.5 to 30 million pounds of uranium that grades basically in line with what we see on the neighboring projects. Our consultants called WWC, they're the go-to consultants for ISR in Wyoming. They basically do all of the reports and they do a lot of the permitting as well as some of the construction. So in terms of our initial focus, really, this is quite a big property. It's about 40 miles in strike along the southwestern margin of the Powder River Basin. It's over 55 square miles of mineral rights within that overall project area. As I mentioned, 3,800 historical drill holes.
Yeah.
The historical resource that was defined on the project is 1.7 million pounds at that 0.103% U3O8. It's about 2 pounds per ton. So, remember I said uranium spot price right now is $60, term price is 80. So we're looking quite economic at those levels. And really, the thesis here is the uranium price is going to continue to go higher, and these just become more and more profitable. You can see that these are the three main areas of historical mineralization: the saddle, spur, and stirrup areas. So in terms of the actual exploration, this is what we do. So we don't drill core unless we're getting very advanced. We don't even drill RC. We drill mud holes. So open hole mud drilling. That's an example of the drill rig. That's an example of the hole. We have cuttings that come up. We look at the cuttings. We log the cuttings, but we don't sample them. What we do is we take a geophysical probe. As you can see that right here, that gets lowered down the hole. You can see one of the examples of the logs here, and it's taking various geophysical measurements as it gets lower down the hole. The one that is most meaningful for us is the gamma radiation log. That is basically a representation of what the concentration of uranium in the rocks. The probes are calibrated once a week at test pits in Casper, Wyoming. So we know basically when we can convert the gamma radiation reading from the probe into percent U3O8, and that's how we do our exploration. Here we are in terms of just a zoom in area. You can see sort of the squiggly, that's basically the roll front. So you've got the zones of mineralization. Spur or saddle was the largest historical zone. It was just over 500,000 pounds, a pretty good grade, 0.13%. We really initially focused the exploration program this year on these areas of known mineralization. Start with what where you have the most information, and then work out from there. In terms of the drilling, it was quite successful. We were infill drilling, so it better be. It was good to confirm. But then really we pivoted the program midsummer to really trying to expand those zones. And we were quite successful in doing that. I'm sure this is one of our drill tables. You can see the depth of mineralization. Remember I said up to 1,000 feet is economic. You can see here we're hitting our zones in the area of 200 to 500 feet. So very good from that. Our thicknesses are in the sort of 2 to 7 foot range. And then our percent U3O8. Remember what I said, the average for the area is about 0.1. So we're getting quite good grades in some of these areas. Grade thickness is a similar quick way, similar to, gold guys, grade times thickness, gold in grams per ton, thickness in meters. I always use 30 as a good sort of benchmark. For us, anything over 0.2 on a grade thickness perspective. So if you take the grade and percent U3O8 and the number of feet, in Wyoming, anything over 0.2, you get pretty excited about. So you can see we've got some excellent grade thicknesses at both the saddle zone and the spur zone. In terms of, this is the saddle zone, just to zoom in here, you can see some of our drilling. What I really want to show though is if I just think I can just click there. So this is some of the modeling that we've done. The holes in blue here are holes we've done. The holes in black are some of the historical holes. We do have the logs for those holes, which is an incredibly valuable resource. We're able to use that. This is some work that one of our senior geologists have done. I haven't seen many of these roll fronts modeled up in leapfrog before, so it's really, really cool. And she's done quite a groundbreaking work on that. She's actually got an abstract into SEG right now. For publication on the work that she's been doing on it. So it's really great to be able to see that. And when we do move to the resource delineation stage, that we're going to be able to lean on quickly. These are just some more examples of sections showing the high grade zones at the south. Move down to the spur. There's so this is a good example. This was the historical zone of mineralization right here. Those are some of our confirmatory holes. Most of those were drilled before I joined the company. One, I said, guys, we've done enough confirmation. Let's start growing this thing. That's how we're going to add value for shareholders. So we're able to find an extension. It's really proved my thesis that there is other zones of mineralization here. These weren't fully defined. They can be extended. So we were very successful in terms of extending that. You can see there, that's a cross section across the northern part of and then over here, you can see all the new holes. So basically the old drilling stopped right here. These are all of our new holes that we drilled this summer that basically extended that mineralization meaningfully to the south. If I go back overall, the saddle, spur, and stirrup areas, we think they're all going to connect, and that will, meaningfully grow that 1.7 million pounds. This is the stirrup area. Again, I'm not going to spend too much time there. Some more drill results there. So that's one aspect of the exploration program, extending and expanding the historical zones of mineralization. Our target, though, is a minimum of 10 million pounds. We'd really like to get to 15 million pounds. At 15 million pound 43101 compliant resource, our parent company, Encore Energy, has an option to reacquire a 51% interest in the project. In order to do that, they have to pay us 2.5 times our exploration expenditures and carry us to production for our share of the capital. So it's a very, very good outcome for shareholders. So we're exploring aggressively in order to try and get to that 15 million pound target as quickly as possible. Um, Extending and expanding historical zones probably won't do it on itself. It's not going to take us from 1.7 to 15, probably take us from 1.7 to 3 or 4. So really what we need to do is make some new discoveries. So the other second half of my hypothesis on the project is most of the historical work done on the western side. There was a different ownership to the east with very little exploration done for uranium over in this area. However, we've got Nichols Ranch that's currently being restarted. We've got Christensen Irrigary up here that has been restarted. I think that the mineralization, and the roll fronts likely continued over in this area. And lo and behold, we were able to make two discoveries late in this program when we pivoted to start testing some of those targets. What there has been on the eastern part of the property is a lot of exploration for coal bed methane. There are many, many coal bed methane holes. And guess what? They were cased, but after they cased them, before they put them into production, they did well with gamma. So we're able to use that as a guide, help us and be more efficient in drilling. So we're able to make two discoveries that just right in mid-December before we stop drilling. And we'll be starting up in just 2 months' time now, in middle of May, once the weather clears up a little bit for us. And that'll be our high priority to figure out how big those two new zones, the outpost zone and the trail dust zone are, and how many pounds we can add there. So in terms of overall, that's the Casey project. That's our flagship. A huge benefit of working in the States is the amount of work that's been done in the 70s and 80s on uranium. A huge challenge is most of that data is, first of all, privately held. Second of all, paper-based. So we spend a lot of time going through, archives, looking for drill logs. So in our search for more information on the Casey project, we actually came across a number of holes that was drilled west of the interstate on the Tinsley project. And it was actually a past producing uranium mine in the 50s. There was a number of holes drilled there in the early 70s, testing for more roll fronts over there. They weren't successful in defining, they found some uranium mineralization, but they couldn't figure it out because it wasn't really, it didn't fit the roll front model. Well, that's because it's not a roll front. This is more unconformity style mineralization that we're seeing at Tinsley. Basically, we're seeing uranium mineralization along the unconformable upper and lower contacts of the Tinsley sandstone. The mine was located on the upper contact. Most of the drilling was done testing this upper contact where they couldn't really make sense of it because the unconformity hosted deposit wasn't yet identified when they were doing this exploration. There was a consultancy that came out and said they think the project property was exciting for that style of mineralization after the unconformity model was developed in the late 70s. But the project never got funding to test that. So they drilled over 100 holes. Most of them were shallow, as I mentioned. They drilled 10 holes for stratigraphy that went through the entire Tinsley formation, so about 380 feet. 8 out of those 10 hit mineralization on the lower contact. So we'll be drill testing that later this year as well. So that's really the geology part of the presentation. We are in a very cool part of the world. Obviously, like anywhere, ESG is a big thing. We have to get social license. Permitting's easy as long as you keep the ranchers on side. We need to not only have a permit from the Wyoming Department of Environmental Quality, we also have to have surface use agreements with the local landholders, all of whom are ranchers, all of whom run cattle or sheep on the property. So we have to have good relationships. So we do a lot locally in the community along those lines. We sponsor the local rodeo, the Chris Ledoux Days. I'm not sure if there are any country music fans in there, but Chris Ledoux is from the town of Casey, and is quite a local celebrity. Before he passed, his son is a country musician and lives there, and his widow is one of our landholders, and we have a surface use agreement with her. We do a lot of sponsorships of the local 4-H and the Future Farmers of America. There's a museum. I'll talk a little bit about the history of the property, the area, because it's kind of cool. But there's a museum, so we're the sponsor for their annual rifle raffle, which is their main fundraiser. So we try to do a lot in the local community, and this is what I'm talking about. So again, like my dad was a big fan of Western movies. And I'd heard a little bit about the range wars or the cattle wars in Wyoming, but this was the epicenter of them. In the late 1800s, 1892 actually, there was a big standoff in the town of Casey between Nate Champion, who's the fellow in the statue here, and a number of the cattle barons. He held them off for a number of days before they eventually got murdered. But then there was a siege by the townspeople on the cattle barons, and it was a huge battle. And that took great place. It took place right in the town, so it's a pretty cool area. There's been a number of movies. The Johnson County War movie, I think it was in the early 2000s. And this is the main strip down the town. Casey has about 250 inhabitants, but they have a bar called the Invasion after the Johnson County Wars. And I stay there. We have a ranch house, but the local hotel is the Cassidy Inn, named after Butch Cassidy because he once stayed there. So it's a very very rich area of history. So um, and anyone's welcome to come visit. I didn't spend too much time on the investment side of things. This is our capital structure. We've got about 100 million shares outstanding. We're trading right around 30 cents, so a $30 million market cap. We raised about $13 million in November, so we're very well funded for the next year and a half worth of exploration. Encore, as I mentioned, is our largest shareholder at 19.9%. I own about 2% of the company myself. Those are shares I bought when I joined. And I continue to buy. I bought some more this morning because I think it's a really good value. So um, that's really the conclusion of my talk. I do put out for anyone who's interested. Um, when I was on the brokerage side, I wrote a daily note, basically on all the stuff that I thought was most relevant in the mining space. I'm doing a weekly note now dedicated strictly to uranium and nuclear related issues and happenings over the course of the last week. So basically a one-stop shop for all that's happened. So anyone who would like to be added, just send me an email and I can add you onto that distribution list. We're quite active on social media. With the Nuclear Fuels Friday feedstock that I put out. We do quite a few interviews. We actually have a podcast that I do with my colleague Janet Sheriff called Mined in America, where we take an aspect of mining in the U.S. and explore it on a twice a month basis. So try to be fairly out there in terms of getting the profile of nuclear fuels to a larger audience. This is my board of directors. Bill Sheriff is the fellow I mentioned off the start. He's the executive chairman of Encore and the non-executive chairman of our company, Nuclear Fuels. The rest of our board, and then yeah, that's probably skip the investment summary and just hand over for any questions.